Hi everyone. I'm going to begin today's webinar on the National Center for Special Education Research's Research Training Programs in Special Education. My name is Katie Taylor and I am a Program Officer at the National Center for Special Education, which I'll refer to as NCSER. And today I'll be talking about the training programs, but specifically about the Early Career Development and Mentoring Program. So in today's webinar, I'll be giving an overview of IES and NCSER, as well as the research training programs, some specifics about the early career program, and also a brief overview of the application submission and the peer review processes. Okay, so I'll start by providing a bit of background on IES. IES is the independent research arm of the U.S. Department of Education, and its overall mission is to describe the condition and progress of education in the United States, identify education practices that improve academic achievement and access to education opportunities, and evaluate the effectiveness of federal and other education programs. IES is comprised of a National Board of Education Sciences, a Standards and Review Office, which oversees the peer review process, and 4 centers. The National Center for Education Evaluation, or NCEE, conducts large-scale evaluations of education programs and supports the development and use of research and evaluation throughout the U.S. The National Center for Education Statistics, or NCES, is responsible for collecting and analyzing data related to education in the U.S. and other nations. And then there are the 2 research centers, the National Center for Education Research and the National Center for Special Education Research. And these are where the grant programs are housed. So both research centers sponsor rigorous research to address education problems in the U.S. The differences between the 2 are that NCR, the Center for Education Research, supports research that's focused on pre-kindergartners through adults, whereas NCSER, the Special Education Research Center, supports research on children birth through grade 12, and NCSER also has a focus on students with disabilities. So you'll notice here that the research centers are separate from the peer review process, which is overseen by the Standards and Review Office. So this separation allows the program officers in NCER and NCSER to work closely with the applicants on their proposals. So the objectives of the IES grant programs are to improve education outcomes for all students, particularly those at risk for school failure. And the grant programs do this by developing or identifying education interventions that enhance academic achievement and can be widely deployed, by identifying what works and what does not work, and then encouraging further research and innovation, and by understanding the processes that underlie the effectiveness of education interventions and the variation in their effectiveness. So now I'll focus on NCSER specifically. So as I mentioned, NCSER sponsors a rigorous and comprehensive program of special education research designed to expand the knowledge and understanding of infants, toddlers, and students with or at risk for disabilities from birth through high school. So NCSER is different from the other research center because of our disability focus and the age range of students that are the research targets. So it's birth through high school. Okay, now I'll provide a brief overview of NCSER's research training programs. The purpose of these programs is to prepare individuals to conduct rigorous and relevant special education and early intervention research that advances knowledge within the field and addresses issues that are important to education policymakers and practitioners. So now I'm going to focus specifically on the early career development and mentoring topic within the research training programs in special education. And I'm going to discuss the purpose of this program, the requirements, the narrative, appendices, and the budget. So the purpose of this program is to prepare researchers who are able to conduct the type of research that IES funds and submit competitive proposals that address relevant special education and early intervention topics, and that meet the methodological requirements specified for IES research grant competitions. So this program provides support for an integrated research and career development plan, which I'll talk more about shortly, and it's specifically for investigators in the early stages of their academic careers. And these grants are intended to jumpstart young investigators to an independent research career. So here's some general information about the award parameters. Early career projects have a maximum duration of 4 years and a maximum award amount of $400,000, and this includes direct and indirect costs. So I want to stress here that you have to adhere to these maximums, both the duration and the budget maximums, in your application, because if you don't, your application will not be sent forward for peer review. So just make sure that you don't even go $1 over this amount. And it's important to work closely with your Office of Research so that they understand these limitations as well. And I also want to note that for training awards, there is an indirect cost rate cap of 8%. So make sure you adhere to that as well. So I want to note here that throughout the webinar, I'll talk about requirements and recommendations. So requirements are the components that you have to include to be sent forward for peer review, whereas recommendations are not required, but they'll strengthen your proposal and make it more competitive. So eligible principal investigators, or the early career researchers, can be from a variety of relevant disciplines and fields in addition to special education. The focus of the research and training needs to be in the field of early intervention or special education for children with or at risk for disabilities. And there are two main eligibility requirements for the principal investigators. The first is that at the time of applying, you have to be within 3 years of receiving your doctoral degree or completing a postdoctoral program. And the second is that you must hold a tenure track position or research scientist or research associate position at an institute of higher education in the U.S., or you must have accepted an offer for such a position to begin before the start of the award. And if you've accepted a position at the time that you're applying but you haven't started, then you need to include a letter of support in Appendix E, which I'll talk more about a little bit later. And this letter of support will be from your future home institution and will indicate that an offer has been made and accepted, and it will also specify an agreed upon start date that is set to begin before the award begins. And the PI's position must be a salaried position paid by the university without a focus on training, so it can't be a postdoctoral position. And then there are two additional parameters related to eligibility that aren't shown here, but those are that the PI must be a citizen or permanent resident of the U.S., and they must not have previously served as a PI or a co-PI on a research grant from IES. Okay, so now turning to the requirements for the mentors. So the career development plan will be conducted under the guidance of a mentor or mentors, and you must designate at least one to guide your research and career development. So you can have more than one mentor, but if you do, you must specify who the primary mentor is, and you have to include a mentor at your home institution. So this can be either the primary mentor or a co-mentor. And you also need to select as mentors only individuals who are not your primary graduate school or dissertation advisor or your postdoctoral supervisor. So in order to meet this requirement, you need to include the names of these individuals in your application. So faculty members who served on your dissertation committee but weren't your direct advisor are fine to serve as mentors. And then mentors can be from academic or non-academic institutions, as long as these institutions conduct rigorous special education or early intervention research. Okay, so just some tips for selecting your mentors. The Institute recommends that you do the following to demonstrate the appropriateness of your mentor selection. So if you propose multiple mentors, include mentors with a variety of areas of expertise. For example, one mentor may have expertise in the relevant content area, and the other may have more expertise in another aspect of your proposed research plan. For example, the statistical analyses or some other aspect of the content. You should also select mentors with appropriate expertise in research with infants, toddlers, children, or youth with or at risk for disabilities, and or their families, teachers, and other instructional personnel. And they should also have strong experience in the specific topic of interest that you've identified. And then another thing to consider is that when you're selecting a mentor at your home institution, you should choose somebody who can guide your career development there. So someone who can help you navigate the institution's procedures for grant submission or for obtaining tenure, as well as provide additional content and or methodological expertise. So some other questions to consider when you're identifying your mentors. Are they committed to training? In other words, do they have experience training doctoral, postdoctoral, or other early career researchers? Do they have the time to devote to mentoring? Do they have IES funding? It can be useful to have mentors who have IES funding and can review your proposal and make sure the language is consistent with IES and help guide you so that you are prepared to do the type of research that IES funds. Okay, so your research focus. Your research and career development plan must focus on infants, toddlers, preschool children, or students in K through 12 with or at risk for disabilities, and or their families, teachers, related services providers, and or other instructional personnel. So if you propose to focus on children at risk for a disability, you need to present evidence of an association between risk factors in your sample and the potential identification of a specific disability, and also clearly identify the disability or disability categories that the children are at risk for developing. So the determination of risk can include, for example, factors used for moving children to higher tiers in a response to intervention model. However, evidence consisting only of general population characteristics is not sufficient for this purpose. So labeling children as at risk for disabilities because they are from low-income families or are English learners is not appropriate to identify children at risk for disabilities. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the training program narrative, and this is the content of your application, or the majority of the content of your application. And early career applications must include a narrative that has these 5 sections: so significance, research plan, career development plan, personnel, and resources. And I'll talk about each one of these specifically. Okay, so your significance section must describe your need for further career development. And this is especially important if you've already received postdoctoral training. So what you'll need to do here is explain why additional training is needed, or what you need to add to the training that you've already received. For example, it could be analytic skills that you need to acquire, or a particular content area within special education. You'll also need to justify and describe your planned program of research, which means describing your progression from your prior research to your currently proposed research, and then also connecting that to your future research. And then you also need to describe the significance of the proposed research project. And this includes the empirical and theoretical rationale for the research and the practical importance of the research questions and the research itself. So we recommend that you clearly describe your research questions and hypotheses, as well as the shortcomings of current practice and the importance of your research plan. And then we also recommend that you address the significance of the career development plan. For example, you should describe what kind of additional training opportunities you'll pursue and how the mentoring and training activities support your research activities. So your career development plan really needs to be integrated with your research plan so that the training activities are supporting the research and vice versa. And then finally, you'll need to address how your research and career development activities will enhance your knowledge and skills. And in your application, you must identify one special education research topic and one research goal. And these topics and goals are described in more detail in our Special Education Research Grants RFA. So starting with the research topics, the topics identify your field of research. So our special education program includes 11 research topics. And when you're determining the most appropriate topic for your research, it's helpful to refer to the RFA for our Special Education Research Grants program. And all of these research topics don't cover the same populations. For example, all topics except for early intervention require children to be in at least kindergarten. And then each topic has certain parameters and certain considerations. So it's important to carefully review the topic descriptions when you're crafting your application. And the research goal is the other thing you need to identify in your application. So the goal specifies the type of work you'll be doing. And under the early career program, you can propose to do research under Goal 1, exploration, Goal 2, development and innovation, Goal 3, efficacy and replication, or Goal 5, measurement. So we do not include the effectiveness goal, which is Goal 4, for the early career program due to the budget limitations for these awards. And so I'll provide a brief overview of each of these goals. However, you can get a more detailed description of the requirements and recommendations for each of these in the Special Education Research Grants RFA. Okay, so the exploration goal. The purpose of this goal is to explore associations between malleable factors that are under the control of the education system and student education outcomes. These projects can also identify factors and conditions that may mediate or moderate these relations. And exploration projects are really intended to build and inform theoretical foundations to support the development or evaluation of interventions or assessment frameworks. And you can propose a variety of methodological approaches under the exploration goal, including secondary data analysis, primary data collection, meta-analyses, or a combination of any of these. Okay, so Goal 2, the development and innovation goal. These projects support the development of an innovative intervention or the improvement of an existing education intervention. And they also collect data on the intervention's feasibility, usability, and fidelity in authentic education settings, as well as pilot data on the intervention's promise for improving student education outcomes. Okay, Goal 3, efficacy and replication. In general, the cost maximums for the early career grants may not be sufficient for conducting rigorous Goal 3 efficacy and replication projects. However, there may be some instances, given characteristics of the intervention or the research design, where these trials actually are possible given the cost maximums. And if that's the case, then you can propose to do a Goal 3 project under the early career program. So there are 4 different types of studies under the efficacy and replication goal. The first is an efficacy study to evaluate whether or not a fully developed intervention is efficacious under limited or ideal conditions. The second is a replication study to generate additional evidence for an efficacious intervention by either directly replicating the intervention or varying the original conditions. The third is an efficacy follow-up study to gather follow-up data and examine the longer-term effects of an efficacious intervention. And then the final type is a retrospective study to analyze retrospective or historical secondary data to test the efficacy of an intervention that was implemented in the past. And then lastly is Goal 5, the measurement goal. And this supports the development of new assessments or the refinement of existing assessments. and the validation of these assessments or the validation of existing assessments for specific purposes, contexts, and populations. And these projects must link the assessment to student education outcomes. Okay, so now I'll discuss the research plan and career development plan in more detail. And both of these plans are designed to enhance your knowledge and skills. And as I mentioned, these plans must be integrated, which means that your career development plan must support the research plan and vice versa. Okay, let's focus on the research plan specifically. So first, you'll need to specify your research topic and your research, which I previously mentioned, as well as clearly lay out your research questions and your specific aims. So your research design should be framed within your chosen topic and goal, and it must be aligned with your research questions. So here you'll describe your design and the actual research process. For example, if you're proposing to develop an intervention, you'll explain the iterative process of developing and refining the intervention and the research design that you'll be using to pilot test its promise for improving student education outcomes. So for the sample description, you'll need to specify your population of interest, your sample size, the disability category or categories represented, and your criteria for defining disability or at risk for disability, and your inclusion criteria. So as I mentioned previously, when we say children at risk for disabilities, we mean they're at risk for developing disabilities based on evidence of an association between a risk factor or a set of risk factors and the development of the disability. So selection into the study must be made on an individual basis, meaning that at risk can't be defined based on a general sample characteristic such as low socioeconomic status. And although your focus needs to be on students with or at risk for disabilities, you can include students without disabilities if it's appropriate for your research question. And you must measure student education outcomes, which include developmental outcomes, school readiness, academics, social and behavioral or functional outcomes. And these are defined and examples are provided in the RFA. But for your key outcome measures, you'll need to describe each measure that you'll use to collect data, including information about their reliability and validity. And if you're doing secondary data analysis, you need to explain the variables that you intend to use from the extant data set. And then in the data analysis section, you'll describe your planned analysis procedure, such as hierarchical linear modeling or structural equation modeling, or if you're proposing a single case experimental design, then visual analysis. So you need to be explicit about how the analyses address each research question and then tie them directly to the research questions. So when you're developing the research plan, we encourage you to work with your mentors, and they can assist you in the development of this plan. But even though the research plan must be included in the proposal, certain aspects, for instance, the research design or the data analysis plan, on which you propose to receive additional training, may be described in less detail compared to proposals submitted to the Special Education Research Grants competition. So we anticipate that there will be further development of these plans based on your training experiences and guidance from your mentors. That being said, the level of detail that you provide here should align with your expertise and the proposed training activities. For example, if you have expertise conducting single case experimental designs, then the Institute would expect a detailed description of the design requirements. On the other hand, if your career development plan includes training in single case design, then the Institute would not expect a detailed description of the design requirements. However, you should describe the type of single case design you propose to conduct and how it's an appropriate design to address your research questions. So bottom line is reviewers need enough detail to be able to judge the feasibility and appropriateness of your research plan. So some other questions to consider when you are writing your research plan. First, think about what education problem that you want to solve and what questions you want to answer. So when you're formulating your research plan, think about how your research questions fit with one of the IES research topics. And also think about the content that you'll address and what sample you'll study. And finally, think about how your research method fits in with the requirements of your identified research goal. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the career development plan. And there are two components of this plan, the mentoring process and then the additional training opportunities. So both of these components must be integrated with and support the research plan. So in your career development plan, you'll describe your training goals and how the proposed activities will help you reach these goals, as well as the roles that your mentor or mentors will play in helping you achieve these goals. So for each mentor, you want to describe their expertise and how it's relevant to your particular program of research. Specify how the mentors will guide you through the process of refining and implementing your research plan, as well as helping you progress toward independent research. You should also describe how your mentors will assist you in acquiring new expertise and guiding your development as a scholar. So mentoring activities can include regular meetings, review of your career development plan, and any additional guidance that would be useful for you in your development as a scientist. For instance, reviewing manuscripts for publication, developing grant applications, or helping you with your dissemination plan. And you should also describe a plan for coordinating mentoring activities if you have multiple mentors. So for the career development plan, it's really helpful to include a timeline of the mentoring and training activities, as well as the research activities, to show how these activities are integrated and how the training that you receive will be able to inform the research plan. So some example training or educational opportunities include the IES Summer Institutes. You can also propose to participate in grant writing workshops or advanced statistical workshops, or coursework that's related to either a content area or a certain statistical technique. Just be sure to describe how these educational opportunities will help you reach your concrete training goals and how they'll support the proposed research. Okay, the personnel section is the next component that's required for your training program narrative. And the focus of this section is mainly on you as the PI, as well as on your mentors. So you should also include other personnel, such as consultants, if you have them on your project. But as the early career researcher, you may want to spend a little bit more time documenting your skills and your past experience than a more experienced researcher might. So in this section, you should include how your research expertise and your mentor's expertise reflect the focus of IES in terms of both content and methodology. So think about the research topics and the goals that I discussed earlier. So you'll want to describe your mentor's prior experiences with mentoring early career researchers, and also describe the special education research projects conducted by your mentors. Also in this section, you should make the time commitments of your mentors very clear, so the percent of effort in the calendar year. So this is really important, and I would suggest highlighting this in multiple places in your application, so in the personnel section as well as your letters of support from your mentors, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And in addition, you must specify the date on which you were granted your doctoral degree, and if applicable, the date that you completed your postdoc. You also need to specify the names of your dissertation advisor or graduate school advisor, and if relevant, your postdoctoral mentor. And lastly, you need to specify who is the primary mentor if you have multiple mentors. Okay, and then the last component of the narrative is the resources section. So in this section, you want to demonstrate that your institution has the capacity to support you in conducting the project that you're proposing. So here you should not use the university boilerplate language. Instead, you want to make sure that this section specifically addresses the needs of this particular project, including both the research and the training components. So you should describe the institutional training support. For instance, do they offer workshops? Maybe they offer sessions related to grant writing. There may also be research groups at the university that you can join that are related to your area of research or to a specific analytic skill. And then you'll also want to describe any startup packages that are provided by your institution. For example, if as a new faculty member the institution gives you extra money or reduces your course load, then you can include that as a resource and an example of how the institution is supporting you. And then we also recommend that you describe the resources to carry out your plans to disseminate the results of your early career project. And this dissemination plan should be detailed in Appendix A, which I'll talk about in a minute. But in terms of the resources, this should include a description of the capacity to disseminate information about the findings from your project. For instance, your university may have a communications office that can assist with disseminating the results of your project, or you may have mentors that are really experienced in disseminating research to certain audiences. Okay, so this is a table showing all of the required and optional appendices for the early career program. So as I mentioned, Appendix A is required for all applications to the early career topic, and it should include your plans to disseminate the findings from the project. And the dissemination plan should be tailored to the audiences that your research may benefit and reflect the unique purpose of their particular research goal. So in your dissemination plan, you should identify the audiences that you expect will be most likely to benefit and discuss the different ways in which you intend to reach these audiences. So as I mentioned, this plan also needs to reflect the purpose of your project's research goal. For instance, findings from exploration type projects are likely to be most useful in pointing out areas for further attention, rather than providing proof or strong evidence for taking specific actions. Okay, and then Appendix B is only required if you are resubmitting a previous application. And this is where you would want to include your responses to the previous reviews. And then also include Appendix B if your application is one that you consider to be new but that is similar to a previous application. And then Appendix C is also required for all applications. And this is where you would include a summary table of you and your mentor's ongoing and recently completed special education or early intervention research projects. And then Appendix D is also required and should include letters of agreement from all of your mentors. And these letters should include enough information to make it clear that your mentors understand the nature of the commitment, the resources, and the mentoring activities that will be required if the application is funded. So this is another place to make it really clear about the percentage of time the mentor will be devoting to the project. And then Appendix E is also required, and this should include letters of agreement from your institution as well as from your school partners, data sources, and consultants if applicable. So the letter of agreement from your institution should also include enough information to make it clear that they understand the nature of the commitment, time, space, and the resources that will be required if the project is funded. And if you haven't started your position by the time that you submit the application, this letter should include your start date as well as details of the offer and of the acceptance. And then as far as the letters of agreement from your school partners, these will be from the authentic education setting that you intend to partner with. And here again, you just need to make sure there's enough information so that it's clear that your partners really understand what they'll be asked to do if the application is funded. And if you're proposing to do secondary data analysis, then you'll also want to include letters of agreement from the data sources. For example, state agencies that hold the administrative data you're proposing to use. And then lastly, if you have any consultants on your projects, then you will need to include letters of agreement from each consultant in Appendix E. And then lastly, Appendix F is optional. However, you can use this space to provide examples of training or research materials and tables and charts that support the training program narrative. For instance, you can include here a project timeline and a table of the research and career development activities. You could also include examples of materials that will be used in the intervention or the assessment that's the focus of your project, as well as any figures, charts, and tables that supplement the project narrative. You can also include examples of measures to be used in the project. Okay, so the RFA includes specific information about the budget for early career grants, but I'll just highlight a couple of things. So you can budget your salary up to 50% of what your academic year salary is. And it can be used for protected time or buying out classes so you can concentrate on the research. And this is not required, especially if you have a startup package that already includes this, but you can budget for this. And then you can also provide honoraria for mentors for up to $4,000 total per year. So if you have more than one mentor, this $4,000 limit needs to be divided up among the multiple mentors. And your budget is expected to cover costs directly associated with the research project as well as the career development plan. So it can include things like salary, staff, supplies and equipment, participant compensation, local travel for data collection, registration for workshops and training institutes, as well as travel. So travel for you and your mentors to meet if you're not at the same institution, travel for conferences, and then definitely travel for the IES PI meeting, which is required for all IES PIs and happens annually. Okay, so the last thing I'll talk about today is the application submission and the peer review process. So all important dates and deadlines are included in the RFA. We encourage you to submit a letter of intent if you're interested in applying. These are optional, so you don't have to submit a letter, so if you don't submit a letter, you can still submit an application. However, I would still encourage you to email me with the brief description of your early career project and just let me know that you intend to apply. And be sure to leave yourself plenty of time to submit your application because we do not accept late applications. Okay, so now let's talk about how to apply. Please note that there is an IES application process webinar. And in that webinar, IES staff will go into more detail about the application process. But for now, I'll talk broadly about how this process works. So you need two things to apply. First, you need the RFA, which contains information for writing your training program narrative, as well as other information related to submitting. But you also need the application package, which can be found on grants.gov. So here is a screenshot of grants.gov where you can find and download the application package. And in terms of registration for grants.gov, the first tip, and perhaps the most important, is to start this process early. So initial registration can take more than 5 business days. And grants.gov actually recommends allowing 4 weeks to register. And even if you're already registered, the annual update that you have to complete could take more than 3 days. So just be sure to start this process early. And it's actually your institution that needs to register, so not you as an individual. And for most institutions, the Sponsored Projects Office will take care of the registration if it hasn't already been done. But you want to make sure to check in with them to ensure that it's been completed. And then applications received by grants.gov are date and time stamped to the second. So your application must be fully uploaded and submitted on the date and time specified in the RFA. As I mentioned, we'll not accept late applications. Okay, so once you successfully submit your application, it will go through the peer review process. So first, applications are reviewed for compliance and responsiveness to the RFA. And compliance is the process of screening applications for acceptance for review that focuses on adherence to the application rules. For example, completion of all parts of the application and inclusion of the required appendices. Responsiveness, on the other hand, involves determining whether you adhere to the requirements of the competition, so the components that are the minimum necessary to be sent forward for peer review. And if your application is found to be both responsive and compliant, then you'll be assigned to a review panel, and 2 to 3 panel members will conduct a primary review of your application and provide feedback about that application. And then once a primary review of each application has occurred, the most competitive applications are then forwarded for review by the full panel of reviewers. And then during the panel review, applications are discussed and then rated by all reviewers on the panel. And from that point, we make funding decisions and then contact all applicants, giving them statements from the reviewers so that those who did not receive funding can potentially resubmit, depending on whether we repeat the competition in subsequent years. Okay, and if you want to learn more about the peer review process, you can follow this link to find out more information from the Standards and Review Office, who oversees the peer review. And you will be notified whether or not you've received funding for your application. So notifications come through the Applicant Notification System, or ANS. And that system is one that you get prompted to sign up for once you've submitted your application. Or if you've submitted before, you should already have an account. And it provides you with information about the status of the award. And then when summary statements of reviewer comments are released, it provides you with those as well. So if you're not granted an award the first time around, I'd encourage you to review your summary statement and talk to me to get some insight into what you can do differently and ways to think about the reviewer comments to help you improve your application. And if you submitted in a previous year and plan to resubmit, I'd also be happy to discuss your previous reviews with you. Another thing I want to encourage you to do is go to our website and look at the resources page. So this is a page that provides links to different trainings and other information and content that could help you improve your application, such as information about methodology or things of that nature. In addition, there are a number of webinars that you can benefit from, and you can find these webinars by going to the Funding Opportunities page, and then there will be a link to our research funding webinars. So just some reminders, make sure to attend to the budget and grant period limits. Make sure you attend to the materials that you should include in the appendices, as well as the recommendations to improve your application. And lastly, read the request for applications really carefully. Most of the information that you need for applying is in the RFA, so this is a very, very helpful resource. And also, email me, the program officer for this particular program, early on if you want to schedule a phone call to talk more in depth about your proposal, or just ask me quick questions through email. So as long as it's within a reasonable time frame, I can also review draft proposals or parts and pieces of your proposals and provide feedback. And here's a link to the funding page and also my email address if you'd like more information or want to talk more about your proposal. And thank you all for participating today.